Hey folks, in our never-ending quest to understand personality, we are tackling a really important issue in today's episode, and it relates to the Myers-Briggs dichotomy of thinking and feeling. Let me be the first to tell you that whatever personality type you have, you're normal and there's nothing wrong with you. And I think this conversation really speaks to the fact, and it's a great point that Mark and I both try to get across in our podcasts. You have your own unique gifts. Sometimes we all just miscommunicate and we say things that we wish we didn't, and conflict happens. So we're here to help you through all of that. If you are a thinking type, feelers may mystify you for a number of reasons. They may frustrate and annoy you because of all of their feelings. And if you're a feeling type, like both Mark and I are, you may feel like you are minimized or just told to get over it. It's not personal, one of my favorites. And those things may annoy and frustrate you too. So if any of this sounds familiar, you are definitely going to want to tune into this episode where we break down this dichotomy and give you some pointers on interacting with both thinkers and feelers. Enjoy. Welcome to the new Myers-Briggs Question Corner. I'm Edythe Richards.
And I'm Mark Mathey.
And we're here to answer your questions about all things personality and all things Myers-Briggs.
From college to careers to relationships, personality is the key to finding the right fit.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another exciting episode of Myers-Briggs Question Corner. Last time, we talked about both my type and Mark's type. I am an ENFP type, and Mark is an INFP type. We also talked about which work environments frustrate us and make us feel good. We touched briefly on the dichotomy of introversion and extroversion, also intuitive and sensing, some on perceiving and judging. We didn't really get into the thinking and feeling dichotomy quite so much. So this dichotomy is very interesting, and I thought we'd delve into that a bit more. So what do you think about that, Mark?
Absolutely. I feel this dichotomy is so important because it really centers around how we make decisions. I think our audience will greatly benefit from this. And also kind of the terminology of thinking and feeling can be kind of confusing. Being a thinker doesn't mean you're like Plato or Aristotle, right? And don't have feelings. And feeling doesn't mean that you can't think. I think sometimes people get really confused about the terminology. So I think this dichotomy needs some further exploration. Don't you think, Edythe?
Yeah, definitely. And I like how you said that. Just because you're a thinker doesn't mean you don't feel, and just because you're a feeling type doesn't mean you don't think. So let me first start by explaining what this really means. And quick reminder to all of our listeners, all of us fall on a continuum. We all do both thinking and feeling things, but there's one that comes more easily and more naturally to you than the other. And that's what we mean by preference. So folks tuning in, if you have a preference for thinking, you probably rely on objectivity when you make decisions. You evaluate situations and people based on logic and facts and data. You are likely to confront situations directly, and conflict probably isn't such a scary thing for you. You are ruled by your head, not your heart. You value truthfulness over tactfulness. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't have feelings or emotions. It just means that you prioritize objective judgment and logic over empathy and the personal impact on people. Now, if you are a feeling type, and again, this is both you and me, Mark, you value harmony over logic, And we feeling types make decisions from a values-based perspective. We naturally consider the impact of our decisions on other people. We tend to be warm and compassionate. We tend to be relationship focused. We may be peacemakers because we are more conflict avoidant than thinking types. And that word conflict, we don't like conflict. We might sweep things under the rug. Now, I think it's common to say that thinkers are critical while feelers are emotional. But again, it's important to say that we can both be equally critical or emotional. And it comes down to which we prioritize when we make decisions, truth or tact. That's an easy way of looking at it. So with this dichotomy, it's easy to see where we can have some miscommunications. And the fact is that all of us, we have to deal with thinking and feeling types because half the population is thinking and the other half is feeling, or in some statistics say that there are more feelers than thinkers. But the fact is we're going to have to deal with both at one point or another. So this brings me to a question for you, Marc. Do you have thinkers in your life? Do you work with thinkers or, have thinking friends or family members? And, I'm also thinking about you in your career field and being a football coach as a thinker. So can you share a little bit about that and, how these thinkers might impact your life in some way?
You mentioned the fact that there might be more than half of the population might be feelers. I don't think I experience that. It seems like wherever I go, I'm always dealing with a bunch of thinkers, and maybe they're attracted to me. They say opposites attract. I mean, I don't know, but seem to attract a lot of thinkers. And this is but it's funny that you mentioned that in the field that I'm in. So by trade, I'm a teacher. Well, that's a feeling, that's a feeling profession. I want to be around a lot of feelers, but in the coaching profession, which I also coach high school football, but I started coaching college football. It's a lot of thinkers are involved in that particular profession. And it can be very difficult because a lot of times it comes down to making decisions. And there are, I'd say, thousands of decisions that need to be made during a football game. And it's really important to figure out, what type of individual preferences you're dealing with, because it's going to lead you to either a positive decision or a negative decision. One of the things that I struggle with a lot is I want everybody to come. I want to have a win-win proposal. I want people to win. I want people to feel like they're included in conversations, that they feel like things are working out for them. And sometimes I feel like thinkers don't necessarily have to have that feeling. They don't necessarily have to feel that everybody won, because a lot of times their decisions are based on facts and on data. And if the data says this, then that's where we need to go. So I'll even talk a little bit more about this, a little bit specifically about coaching football. So football has become a very analytical profession. And I know a lot of people will think those football players, they're actual thinkers in the modern way we use thinkers, not thinkers as far as MBTI. But yeah, there's a lot of analytical data and research that's being done. So a lot of times you'll see in your preparation for the game, they will have all this analytics. You might hear that a lot in sports, analytics where, based on this down and distance, it's a terminology we use in sports, but basically in this situation, the decision is to do this, right? And we're just going to go straight off the data, that sort of stuff. And it doesn't really matter what happens or the results of it. The data made that decision. And sometimes I struggle with it because I think a lot of times sports is a very human endeavor. And, what is the situation? How do people feel in that situation? I think that goes into making that decision overall. And so I feel like a lot of times in businesses and sports, a lot of these decisions are being made. We want to make irrational decisions. We want to make things based off the data, but I just don't think that really happens a lot. So sometimes I struggle with that. I'm definitely not the person that's putting in the data. I feel like a lot of times I can make a good decision based off my knowledge of people and how decisions are being made during the game. But that's kind of where we're headed in our sport. And so I don't know if you've experienced a lot of that, Edythe, in your profession, but being able to make decisions, analytically, data-based in your profession compared to a lot of times making decisions based off of feelings. And if everybody gets a chance to win from that, do you experience that on your job often?
Pretty much every day, like what you described, even though I'm not in a teacher or in the sports profession. But yeah, it does kind of feel like we're surrounded by thinkers. And, something that you just said, Mark, it's you rely on your ability to was it read people or relate to people over the data. So you're prioritizing your interactions with people, I think, over the data. It was something to that effect. And, I'm thinking about that from a thinking point of view. And, they're going to be, most thinking types are going to look at that as inaccurate because it's subjective. It's not necessarily data driven, even though it's, one could argue it's qualitative data over quantitative data. But it speaks to, I think, the way that they come to a decision and how that is different between a thinking type and a feeling type, right? So when I do group activities with Myers-Briggs, one that I use to explain this TF dichotomy, and what I do is, I separate them into groups. One group is thinking, one group is feeling, and you give them a task or a problem to solve. And one that I really like to do to explain this difference is give them the task to fire someone. So imagine that you are a manager, your group is are managers, and you've been told that you need to let someone go from your team due to budget cuts, right? And you have whatever number of people, like you have 10 people on your team and you have to let 5 of them go. So this is the problem. The issue is that everybody on your team is an equal performer. No one's better than anybody else. So all things are equal. How do you decide who you're going to fire? And, you have each group, one thinking group, one feeling group, coming to solve this problem. And it's fascinating to watch the decision-making process for each group. So the thinking group, typically what happens with the thinking group is they get right down to business. They're going to be rational. They're going to be objective. They're ultimately going to find some very impartial way to solve this problem. And usually it comes down to something like drawing straws or something random, right? The feeling group, on the other hand, they're going to have a lot of trouble, at least initially, solving this problem because it's a very human problem, right? Firing somebody. And, you just watch the body language of these people. They're grimacing and they have these pained looks on their faces. And they're saying, a lot of the time overtly, they're saying, oh, I really don't want to do this. I don't want to think about firing somebody. I don't want to hurt somebody, because the whole thing makes them uncomfortable. But inevitably, and this is the really interesting part, both groups come to the same conclusion. It's just their decision-making process is different. Feelers are going to prioritize people and communications and harmony and how they deliver bad information. That's important because feelers want to be tactful. Thinkers prioritize logic and consistency and analyzing. You mentioned that word, being analytical. Absolutely. They're going to look at the pros and the cons, and they're not going to let their own personal wishes or personal feelings or the wishes and feelings of other people influence their decisions. They're going to be truthful, but not always tactful.
That makes so much sense. When you're talking about a decision of firing somebody, like I cringe. So I have the grimace on my face. Like it's a good way to realize if you are a feeler, like if you have to put yourself in that position to fire somebody, do you grimace, or are you a person who's like, well, I mean, it's business, right? Like the whole Godfather line, right? It's not personal, it's business. Like I would struggle like being in that situation because to me, it's all personal. So it's really hard to separate that. And I think when it comes down to it, like a lot of times it helped me to understand the differences is I really feel like thinkers are about the win. And no matter how we can get to that, they care about what's the best way to win. And I think for thinkers, it's not just the win. Yes, we want to win, but it's the win-win. Like how does everybody, that's why I think we struggle with conflict so much and just dealing with that. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about it, just a little bit about like how thinkers and feelers deal with conflict in a way. Like how are they different with that? Because I know I hate it.
Yeah. Very typical for a feeler. We don't like conflict. So an easy way to look at this is that thinkers are going to come at it from a logical, impersonal point of view, and feelers are going to personalize things. Because, like you said, everything is personal to us. But I also want to stress that there's a lot of nuances to this too. So, for example, if we're under a lot of stress, we may behave differently than our natural preferences. So, example, for me at work, if I'm in a stressful situation, I've trained myself to stay stoic and as much as possible not to take things personally. But I just look at the cause and effect of things and I take the personal out of it as much as I can. But, this is something I've had to train myself to do. And thinkers, and I've seen many thinkers react emotionally when someone or something pushes their buttons. So it's important to remember this too. There's always going to be times when we behave outside of our natural preferences. And as I'm recalling this topic about, arguing and looking at things in a different situation, I'm recalling this interaction a couple years back that I had, and it really speaks to this thinking and feeling dichotomy. So there was this guy I know who identified as a thinking type, and he was in his mid or late 30s at the time. And this guy was involved with a gaming group. And this group met in person a few times a week to do their thing. Well, there were some interpersonal dynamics going on in the gaming group with some of the group members, particularly a couple of women who were in the group, and they just did not like this guy for whatever reason. And he was having a really tough time because he wanted to continue participating in this group that he loved, but he wasn't connecting with these women and some of the other group members. And in fact, he was having arguments with these women and about how they were playing the game. And it was getting to the point that he thought he might have to leave the group, but he didn't think that he should leave the group because he firmly believed that these other women were wrong and he was right. So he shared something with me that he did that could be considered offensive. So I remember that. I just don't remember what it was because it was so long ago. But I do remember having a pretty visceral reaction to it. And I was thinking that, wow, if he did this to me, like I would be offended. So I could understand why these other women were offended. And I think we had this conversation and there was a misunderstanding of his intentions. And I think we talked about that and how he might have been coming across, because he's not a bad guy. He was just kind of clueless in terms of certain aspects of his behavior, right? So what was really interesting, though, was that I explained to this guy how his behavior may have been interpreted and why these women might have taken issue with him. And he was tuning into me, he was listening to me, but I could tell he didn't really believe me. And partly, okay, it might have been just a hot button issue for him, and he was like digging his heels in. But finally, I said, have you ever thought about apologizing for your behavior? And I explained like that for some people, just hearing the words, I'm sorry, can diffuse things and it can calm them down, right? And so I made this suggestion and he said, I can't. And I'm like, what? I'm thinking to myself, what? And he said, I can't apologize. It just kind of stopped me in my tracks because in my mind, I'm thinking, what's the big deal? Anybody can apologize. And sometimes it's what's needed to get through things. And at least maybe part of you might realize that I unintentionally offended somebody. So let me apologize for that, right? But in his mind, he was saying, I can't apologize for something I didn't do. Like literally, I cannot apologize for that. And it took me a really long time to understand what he meant. And I think it really speaks to this thinking feeling dichotomy here, because thinking types, just like anybody else, are perfectly capable of apologizing, right?
Yeah.
They're going to be less likely to apologize just to smooth things over, right? And that's where a feeling type, they might be more apt to want to apologize to just smooth things over. So I think that can be a difference between how these two types handle conflict, right?
I totally understand what you're saying, Edythe, about the thinking and feeling dynamic. And I think I see it every day. Like you see these interactions every day when it comes to making decisions. You have individuals who are seeking harmony, who want to see things work out, don't want to see the conflict, are a little bit into the emotions. They're very cognizant of other people in a group, right? Like sometimes you're in a group and you're very cognizant about how people feel in a group, and are they able to do they want to get things contributed to the group? And you're realizing that maybe they're not, and you want to kind of get them to do that, or get the leader to point those individuals out. I think that stuff's really, really important to be able to have. And you have thinkers who maybe necessarily don't want to get into everybody's feelings and don't want things to be subjective. And so how do we get to making decisions? How do we get to interacting with each other? And I think one of the stories that I always come up with is when I was a head football coach. As a head football coach, I struggled with some of the tasks of being a head football coach. Now, as a position coach, I loved it. My job was to get that player to reach their potential, and I was going to do it. Like I was going to find ways, I was going to research, I was going to do all these things that were needed to help that player reach their potential, because I feel like it's so important for an individual to feel like they can. But what if they can't? like, what if they can't get to that level? It's hard for me to move on from a guy. And I remember one time my head football coach, I'm an assistant position coach. This is an individual that's coaching an individual position. The head football coach would oftentimes come up to me and say, "Hey, Mark, we got to move on. We got to move on from Joey or Bob or, Sarah. We got to move on because they're just not going to get there." And I struggled with that. Well, when I'm now in a role as a head football coach, it's my decision to come up with and say, "Hey, like we have to move on from that." That I struggle with. I've set a standard that I feel like is important for our team to succeed. But what happens when, meeting that standard, or something's going on at home with that individual and they don't reach that standard? Do I lower the standard? And so those were some of the conversations I would have with my coaching colleagues that were thinkers. And they refused, which I totally agree with them. They refused to lower the standard. And at times, if a kid just didn't reach that standard, well, then a consequence was needed. I needed that. I needed them to help me. Like I needed that reminder. I needed them to remind me of that. Right. And so like it's a level where I don't naturally give up on a kid. I'm not saying that you ever give up on kids, right? But like there's some times where a kid's not reaching the standard and we have to move on, right? We have to move on from that situation, or we need to figure out ways to, love them up more, find other reasons. But moving on to, practice two, we have to move on with different individuals. That's something that I had to learn from that. But I think also I was also able to help my coaches understand that in order for your players to reach their potential, you can't be impersonal. You can't be just totally objective. Like you have to understand the individual to reach them so they can reach their potential. So although we're not removing the standard, thinkers, you need to be less impersonal and more personal, less objective and more subjective, less into the data and building relationships to get that individual to give more, right? And then from my standpoint, I had to realize that, look, sometimes the standard is the standard, and you have to rely on that in order to get us to where we need to go. So I think we learn from each other basically by having two different individual preferences in individual groups.
Yeah. And I like how you said that we really do need each other. Like feelers need the thinkers to kind of maintain a standard and really for the best of the group, right? You're not trying to single out one person at the expense of the rest of the people. And thinkers need feelers because they need to be reminded about the humanity of an individual person a lot of the time, right? And a lot of our work environment, sometimes the world in general, I feel like it seems like it favors thinking types because thinking may look like competency. And our world tends to favor logical decisions and truth and honesty and justice. And unfortunately, sometimes I think our world tends to devalue emotion. So if we're considered nice or polite or empathetic in a lot of places, these aren't always either considered positive traits or they're minimized. And I don't know about you, Mark, but I've often felt like I'm overlooked or dismissed because of these things, because I show up with these traits. And, a lot of this, it goes beyond what the Myers-Briggs measures here, because we're humans. And as humans, we're emotional beings. All of us, even the thinking types out there, are still emotional beings. And I'm an emotional intelligence practitioner as well. And I know from my work in this area that if we don't find a way to control our emotions, they will control us. So I've found ways to navigate being a feeler in the workplace, and that's to use my natural power of empathy to build a supportive team. And I regularly ask my team for feedback, and I do whatever I can to support them. And I watch how they function at work. How do they deal with stress? What situations are stressful for them? Try to understand their personality preferences, things they like to do, things they don't like to do. How do they handle deadlines and things like that? So I can notice if they're struggling. And I communicate regularly with people. So if I see a problem, I'll say something diplomatically. I have one lady on my team who's a thinker. And if there's a problem, I tell her straight away. I don't beat around the bush. And that works. I have several feelers on my team, and I generally use, this sandwich approach with them. So I give my negative feedback sandwiched between two pieces of positive feedback.
Smart. That's smart.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be. And yesterday, I had a great day yesterday because one of my direct reports told me that I'm the best manager he's ever had. So I think I'm doing something right. But, this is where we feeling types can really thrive by showcasing our emotional intelligence and building and fostering relationships and collaboration and even conflict resolution and trust and psychological safety. And these are all kind of hot topics in today's world. And I think the world is moving more in this direction to moving away from a completely data-driven, impersonal world to more of a world that values these types of things. But I do think there's more to it than just looking at it from a thinking and feeling perspective per se.
Absolutely. Some of the things that, as you were speaking to, again, points to a lot of the things that we mentioned in our first episode that can really help you once you know about Myers-Briggs is like in any environment, bring your strengths, right? Like bring who you are and your gifts to that field, because that's going to help bring value to where you need to go. So it doesn't mean that when you're in a thinking environment, you're no longer empathic, right? You no longer are going to now care about individuals' decision when it comes to, or individuals' emotions when it comes to decisions. No, like still bring who you are into those fields and continue to try to bring as many of those gifts into those areas and bring in a way to bring value to that job. And another thing that you also mentioned too, Edythe, that I thought was genius is understand who you're dealing with. Like understand the different personality types that you're dealing with in your job. So if you're dealing with somebody who's a thinker, they probably don't want you to be around the bush. They probably don't want to meet, right? But if you're dealing with somebody who is a feeler, they probably do want to discuss how that meeting went and their opinions and their feelings and their emotions. So again, being able to be an individual who understands Myers-Briggs, don't be afraid to be yourself throughout the day, regardless of what that personality type, because those are your strengths, right? And two, be able to understand who you're interacting with and give them what they need and those sorts of things. So I think that's really, really important. One of the things I was doing, I was trying to do my research about thinking and feeling and that sort of stuff, right? And I don't want to get into any stereotypes, but are there more females that are feelers and more males that are thinkers out there just in general?
Yeah, this is well documented. There are more women who are feelers, and statistics on personality
Oh,
type report that it's, the most recent I read, it was like up to 75% of women, but I've seen other statistics that more like 60%. So it's 60 to 75% of women are feelers. Let's just say that. And then we have 40 to 43% of men are feelers. So yeah, it could be that not all men are from Mars and not all
true.
women are from Venus. But this brings up the point of being a feeling man in a world where most men are thinkers. And you being in the sports world, because you've talked about that pretty extensively this time, and how that plays out for you, being a feeling man.
Yeah. As you have said, like I'm a feeler. That's who I am, and I am in a dominated thinking profession in sports, and more specifically in football. And I think one of the things that I try to do is one of the things that you talked about in your job, in your corporate profession, is I try to bring who I am to that field. And one of the things that feelers tend to be is very value based, very value oriented. And there's certain things that we value and we stick by those values. And I think what we do is we end up gaining respect from that. So one of my main values that I think comes from my feeling preference is helping people reach their potential. Like that's who I am, and it doesn't matter who you are. I'm not just going to the most talented person and trying to help them reach their potential. I'm trying to help everybody reach their potential, regardless of what we deem they can offer our football team. And I think what people begin to see as I begin to coach that way, might be coaching a little bit different than they are, they begin to respect you for that. They begin to respect how I'm always there for every kid, not just some kids, how I'm always trying to create ways for people to succeed, win, over just getting the win. A lot of times, we'll celebrate wins. What I care about is that, guys, did you see how Johnny played today? He didn't play perfect, but he played better than he did last week. That's a win for me. It's just not the bottom line for me that I care about. It's about how each individual is progressing. So a lot of times when we look with people with feeling temperaments, right, we see an idea that a lot of times people can look at them as like soft because it's emotional and that sort of stuff. But when it comes to their values, they're very strong and can be very almost appear to be very objective. So now they're
Yeah.
very objective with their values when they used to be subjective. When it comes to the things that they value, they are now very, very objective and kind of look like a thinker. So that's kind of where I feel I am. And I'm not afraid to be myself, knowing that I'm going to be respected for that. And people might ask, can you help me do that more? Work with me on that process. So that's kind of how I deal with being, I guess, an individual from maybe Jupiter, and not necessarily Mars in general.
Yeah, I know, right? And it's speaking to what you were saying there. It's feeling types can still, they can dig their heels in too. And if we're very passionate about something, yeah, I think that's well said, that we can come across as thinking types. Like, no, don't violate my values. If it's something that's very important to me and value centered, we can draw a hard line there. And that's where there can be some, I think, misconceptions about feeling types. People might think, if you're a feeler, that you're just nice and warm and kind and you want everybody to be happy and all that kind of stuff, which is partially true. But if you wrong a feeler, if you step on their values, or if you do something that really pisses them off or makes them upset, you've got to watch out, because feelers can be the most vengeful people ever. Feelers can make people suffer if we want them to. If we feel wronged, we want you to feel our pain.
I mean, I understand that. I'm a coach, so I understand that there has to be different ways in which you have to interact with people to get the best out of them. That's kind of what I was talking about originally. But to do that, you have to understand people, their personalities, and you have to have like what I call a tool belt of strategies that will help you coach them up, lead them, I'm a feeler type, so I understand the sandwich technique that you talked about earlier, Edythe,
Yeah.
and that sort of stuff. And depending on each kid, like you may have to double up the bread on that. It may not be just one positive, one, and then the criticism and then another positive. You might have to double up the bread on that. And in business, you hear a lot about this sandwich technique that you talked about. Some use a 3-to-1 positive to negative ratio. For every negative comment you make, you have to provide 3 positive comments. But here's the thing. These strategies aren't one size fits all. You have to understand people, really get to know them, and then you will know what strategy to use. So one of my players might need the 3-to-1. They might need the sandwich approach, right? But another player might just need the information to get better. They're different people. They're unique individuals. I can't treat everybody the same. I have to understand them and then know what particular strategy in order to be able to use for them. And I really think that the MBTI really helps you figure that out.
Yeah, for sure. Last week I was going through some slides for this presentation I was giving, and I was just talking things through with a bunch of people at work, and I got some unsolicited advice, quite a lot of unsolicited advice. Now, normally I like to hear other people's opinions because I know that I miss things. I appreciate the perspectives that somebody else might have. But this time, the advice that I was getting last week, it wasn't that it was only unsolicited, but it was framed in kind of, at least this is how I felt, it was framed in kind of like a "you're wrong" way. And the perpetrators, and I will call them perpetrators, they didn't have context into this subject. So I wasn't really sure why they were telling me these things. But, I kept my mouth shut, as I've trained myself to do. Keep your mouth shut, just listen, try to be open-minded. And the tone, for some reason, it was just getting more and more critical. And it was hard not to take it personally because, I worked hard on that presentation and I know what I'm talking about. But everything was pointing to the faults of it and nothing was pointing to the good stuff. So in my head, I'm asking myself, well, was there anything that you liked about my presentation? Was there anything good here? So I'm going to say to our thinking friends who are tuning in here, remember that it's not what you say, but it's how you say it. So be careful of how you're expressing whatever you're expressing. Think about your body language. Think about your tone of voice. And don't forget to give praise. So tell somebody what they did well and what you like about their work. Because I think in today's world, we can all use a little bit more of that. When we feelers get criticized, it's painful. So even if the criticism is meant to be constructive and to help us, so it would be helpful, I think, to say something positive in addition to offering the criticism, which is kind of getting back to that sandwich approach there.
Yeah, it's understanding your people, right? It's understanding your people. It's understanding what they need. It's something that we've always talked about. It is about the platinum rule, giving people what they need, not what I need, right? And I think it's very important. And I think one of the things for a lot of people who feel like they might be a fish out of water, right? Like individuals who feel like I just don't feel comfortable in my environment. I don't feel, a lot of times it's personality mismatches, right? And for those individuals who have that fish out of water feeling, I wouldn't look at it as a fish out of water, but I would look at it as you're a different fish in a different water, right? And you're going to still try to make that water or that work for you, right? So I'm going to find a way, try to figure out if you can find a current that allows you to swim effectively. So that's something that's really, really important. Get out of the feeling of like, I'm different. Like I feel like people don't like me, or a lot of times it's just a personality mismatch. Instead, try to figure out, is there a current within that stream that allows you to swim effectively and to do the things that you need to do? Can you get into that environment? Can you do the things that naturally fit you? So that way you don't have to expend as much energy to swim, and then you can get further along, right? That sort of stuff. So being able to do that. And although it's great to be in that environment that works really, really good for you, you can be effective in any environment that's there. And I think that's really, really important to help people function in their day, because one of my things is always like, know thyself and put thyself in the best environment. But what happens if I'm not, right? And that's some of the things that Edythe and
Yeah.
I have been talking about today is that's not the end of you. Just figure out the right stream to feel and then go to and get to that spot. You're a different fish in a different water. Find the stream that effectively works for you.
Yeah, yeah. Great analogy there with the current and the stream, because I mean, ideally, let's face it, we'd all like to be in that current that best suits our natural swimming style, right? But it doesn't always work out that way. And we're at some point we're going to be in environments or with people that are contrary to our natural type. And I want to remind our listeners that if you're like me and you're an ENFP type and you're in the corporate world and you are surrounded by ESTJ and ISTJ types, nothing wrong. Not saying there's anything wrong with ESTJ and ISTJ types. Gotta love my ESTJ and ISTJ peeps. Yeah. But it can be exhausting being around people who are very different from us day after day. And you feel like the anomaly, and you feel like you're swimming upstream constantly because your natural gifts are not always recognized or honored. But I want to remind folks tuning in here that these environments, sometimes they are the best opportunities for growth. Yeah. And I really like what you said earlier, Mark, that this gives you an opportunity to enhance something else inside yourself, to flex to the other areas that don't come quite so naturally. And when you do that, like, hey, you can work in just about any environment.
Yeah, that's absolutely. And I think that's the whole, like, again, it goes back to our win-win. Like,
Yeah.
so we're all leaning on our personality types. Both Edythe and I are like, let's go back to the win-win, right? Like, how can we all win? Even if you're not in the right environment, how can we all win? How can you win? How can we get to a win-win, right? One of the things that, and a lot of times leaning on my intuitive preference, a lot of times my advice can be very general and very pie in the sky and just like, hey, look, just find the right stream, right? And you're going to be in good shape. And probably a lot of our sensors are like, what does that exactly mean? Like, I need specific information and specific tasks and things that I can do in order to be successful. So Edythe, can you please give us some information about, if you're a feeler and you're working in an environment, a thinking environment, or if you're a thinker and you're working in a feeling environment, what's some advice that you can give those individuals?
Yeah. So my advice to all of our feeling friends tuning in, first of all, know that there's nothing wrong with you. You are still a unique person with great qualities. And just because you're a feeler doesn't make you any less than. We all have our own superpowers. And for feelers, it's often the ability to collaborate, to have empathy, to tune in to other people, to harmonize, to help people, and to make this world a better place. I love the win-win, Mark. We want to have a positive impact on other people. And these are all great qualities that we can bring, whatever career choice or whatever workplace or relationships that we're in. Now, to navigate the world of thinkers, first, you want to understand thinkers have the ability to feel just like we have the ability to think. They can adjust themselves just like we can. Different situations are going to call for different emotions. There are times when we need to demonstrate empathy. There's other times when we need to be assertive and express our opinions bluntly so that other people will tune into us. And all of us have the ability to do this. So, secondly, when you are in the heat of the moment, I'm going to plead with you to please think before you reply out of emotion. When we are stressed out, sometimes our emotions can get the best of us, and we're going to be more likely to say things that we might later regret, or say things we didn't really mean, or do things that we wish we hadn't. So be careful of this tendency. If someone hurts us or offends us, we may want to lash out there in the moment. So just be careful, especially in the professional world and online. because this behavior can come back to bite you. And third, this is easier said than done, but practice not taking things personally. The thinker who did you wrong probably isn't giving this situation a second thought. He or she is not dwelling on it. So why are you? Just get up, brush yourself off, and move on.
That's excellent advice. It is.
Yeah.
What about our about our thinking types? Like what's some advice for them?
Yeah. So thinking types, I would say that any type, just try to keep in mind that even constructive criticism can sting and it can make a feeler unproductive. Feeling types are energized through appreciation and encouragement. So just keep that in mind. So any type of criticism, you just want to balance that out as much as you can. And then also remember that whatever problem it is that you're trying to solve, for feeling types, the problem is always secondary to the people who are involved. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So remember that we want to make things better too. We want to solve the problem, but we are also going to look at the impact of whatever solution it is you're proposing and how that will affect people. So the last thing I want to say to our thinking friends who are tuning in, you may struggle with empathy and you may be trying to convince us of something using logic or some type of scientific approach or a cost benefit analysis or whatever analytical tool you have. Understand that feelers want to be tactful and they're going to do whatever we can to establish and maintain harmony. And that's very important to us. So if you're trying to convince us of something, I would say think about approaching it from an empathic point of view and think about how it will affect the people involved.
No doubt. One thing you were mentioning there, I almost had to snicker, but I think the thinking win-win, like how feelers use win-win, is cost benefit analysis. Like I hate that phrase, but it's exactly what we need. But I think thinkers use cost benefit analysis in everything that they do. But I use win-win, they use cost benefit analysis. One of the things that we need to do as feelers too, right? We need to be cognizant of thinkers and feeling occupations. That's what we should be doing. Like we're feeling, so we should be looking and trying to feel like how our thinkers are doing in those type of situations.
Yes.
When I'm in a meeting in school, there's always like one or two thinkers with a bunch of feelers. I'm so laser focused on our thinkers and how they are feeling because I'm always trying to steer the meeting back to the point because I know sometimes we can veer off with just all the different thoughts that our feelers are using. So sometimes we can kind of get steered off of the meeting. And I'm always just kind of telling people if you have a personal comment, you could probably mention that after the meeting just to help our thinkers as they kind of come down to. And, one of the strategies that I have my brother use, and I think it's excellent when he's like facilitating meetings and that sort of stuff, he's so great at reading the room. And so when he feels like sometimes there's, thinkers that need to move on, you see this classically in the Zoom meeting. You can see that there's people engaged in the meeting and you see there's individuals on their phones moving on. One of the things that he'll always say is, there's a feeler really expressing certain things. And as they're getting towards the end, he'll say, let's put a pin in that and come back to that later. And what I really love about that strategy is it doesn't offend the feeler or the feeling types or the next feeler who wanted to talk about their feelings, right? Because there's an idea that we're going to come back and I get to discuss my feelings later. But what it does for the thinker, it makes them jump for joy. And so I love the whole, let's put a pin in that and come back to that later. So that way we can keep the meeting focused, but it also gives our feelers the idea that, we can still discuss this at the end if we have time. So I think it's just a really good tool for your toolbox.
Yeah, I like the put a pin in it too, because it's non-offensive to everybody. It also, it gets into some of the other dichotomies too, the J and the P and the S and the N too. Because especially I'm thinking J and P, because certain people, will naturally go off on tangents and other people, they want to stay laser focused and they're just looking to get out of this meeting and finish things up. And but to bring it back to the thinking and feeling, for the feelers who are tuning in, especially in the professional world, I would say take the emotion out of it as much as you can. Don't over focus on your own feelings or anybody else's feelings for that matter too.
I love it. I love it.
So with that, I think we're going to start to close out here, but what a great discussion, Mark. And this is the dichotomy here that I personally feel can be the most contentious of the four dichotomies of the Myers-Briggs. And, as we were talking about, can cause all sorts of communication mishaps. And, like we said here, that the more we know ourselves, that's the first step in better responding to the people and the situations around you so that we can all work on being more productive. So thank you very much for tuning in. Thanks to you, Mark, for all of your insight into this.
Absolutely. I loved it. Thanks a lot, Edythe. And thank you. Thank you, audience.
All right. Take care, folks.
Thanks for tuning in. Follow us on social media and your favorite podcast platform.
And please reach out to me on LinkedIn and on my website, atopcareer.com, for more updated content. While the Myers-Briggs and MBTI are trademarks of the Myers-Briggs Foundation, viewpoints expressed here are our own.